Hello and welcome to my channel. In today's video I will be going over my MAXX the Hype NITRO list at top 16 at both Battle Hardened Santa Clara and ProQuest Plus Santa Clara. This video will be divided into two parts. The first part will be going over the deck itself, as well as some matchup guides and how to approach certain matchups, and the second part will be giving a recap of both the tournaments. Starting off with the deck tech, here is the deck as presented with both the main deck and the sideboard on your left and your right respectively. A link to the February list is in the description below. I don't have any matchups posted on February itself, but in general you will be running this core alongside a few cards from the inventory depending on what deck you are up against. Going into specifics and starting off with your weapons and equipment, Banksy has become standard after the Armory deck because you are able to transform Bankbreaker into it. Bankbreaker itself isn't too useful right now, but it does present an interesting way for the deck and is necessary for any sort of Jarl or Count Your Blessings matchups. The other interesting thing I'm running in this list is Heavy Industry Gear Shift and Heavy Industry Surveillance. I like this because it blocks better than Hyper X3 and Cogwork Space Legs. Hyper X3 has Battle Warp 1, while Cogwork Space Legs does not block at all. Currently, as it stands, the standard armor suite, that being Banksy, Galvanic Bender, Heavy Industry Gear Shift, Heavy Industry Surveillance, and Technical Foundry Heart, blocks 6, which is relevant for blocking on hits such as Command and Conquer or Erase Face. Additionally, the additional action points generated from Heavy Industry Gear Shift can be relevant in matchups you are not constructing Nitro Mechanoid, which has come into play and will definitely be useful if you are ever about to fatigue yourself. The only downside to this suite is that Heavy Industry Surveillance is susceptible to shred style effects in the Assassin matchup, so if you are running this, you need to be on the lookout for that and not block with that Heavy Industry Surveillance until you are sure you can avoid it. Into Runeblades, Adaptive Dissolver replaces Heavy Industry Gear Shift. AB1 has become standard into every Runeblade matchup, and this allows you to deal with any rune chants or any external arcane damage effects they're presenting. Into Wizard specifically, Visortronic Model 1 replaces Heavy Industry Surveillance, and Adaptive Dissolver replaces Galvanic Bender. You're still running Heavy Industry Gear Shift for the aforementioned additional action points that it can generate. Technical Foundry Heart and Banksy are played in every single matchup. Moving on to the main board itself, this is a pretty stock or standard list. I've made minimal changes to this list since High Octane has been banned. The most notable addition has been Gigawatt, 2 red hyperdrivers, and Gas Up in the sideboard. I am also running 1 Clempress in the main board from the Armory deck. This just helps round out the blues. As it stands, the deck is running 18 blues, which I feel is a perfect amount for what the deck wants to do. In addition, I'm also running Recharge Yellow simply because I like it. Pre-High Octane ban, I was running 7 copies of Recharge, and I feel 5 is a good middle point between what the deck wants to do, as well as not really impeding on any of its goals. It is also important to note that Gigawatt, which has now, in my opinion, become standard after the High Octane ban, buffs any Mechanologist attack, including Banksy, Bankbreaker, and Nitro Mechanoid. Moving on to the sideboard itself, which you can see off to the side, Firewall, Gas Up, T-Bone, Yellow, and Zipper Hit Yellow. Any combination of those generally tends to go into most matchups. For example, if your opponent is running an aggro-heavy deck such as Aurora or Syndra, you will generally want to play Firewall. If your opponent is running a lot of Blade Break armor, you'll generally want to run T-Bone. If your opponent is not running a lot of Blade Break armor, you'll generally want to include Zipper Hit, and so on and so forth. Max Velocity is in here just as a popper. In general, the deck does not have the capability of boosting 3 times per turn and then carrying over 2 resources. Not that it is impossible, the list just isn't designed to do this. The second notable piece from the Armory deck is Construct Bankbreaker, which only goes into Jarl because Jarl can destroy your equipment, and for Count Your Blessings matchups, in which case it allows you to get additional material under Nitro Mechanoid. Thankfully, I didn't encounter any Count Your Blessing decks this weekend, but I did encounter some Jarls where Construct Bankbreaker didn't end up being too useful, so I might end up replacing that for for other cards. Also important to note with MAXX in general is that you shouldn't be afraid to go over 60 cards. In a lot of matchups I end up running 62 or sometimes even 65 cards, especially into slower or more mid-rangey decks such as Victor and Prism and Enigma, because that additional deck count can help you win games you otherwise would be losing to fatigue. Speaking of the cards in the Armory Deck, let's take a quick tangent to talk about the Armory Deck itself. In my opinion, this Armory Deck is about half a step forward, because while it introduces new playstyles and new game plans for the hero, everything in the deck feels half-baked. Going over the specific cards themselves, Constraint Bankbreaker is not really a good replacement for Nitro Mechanoid, and it doesn't really prove to be too useful in most matchups, mainly because it is missing Banksy's on-hit, which means there's no way to keep Clampress around once you play it and you have transformed into Bankbreaker. On the other hand, you still need to crank to attack with Bankbreaker, meaning that in most cases you're just playing a bad version of Banksy that is missing the on-hit, and while you can attack twice with Bankbreaker, that second attack doesn't really end up changing the tides of the game a whole lot much. You also need to keep in mind that you can't make Bankbreaker on top of Nitro Mechanoid, which means you are pretty much pigeonholed into one playstyle or the other, with very few matchups having that overlap between Bankbreaker and Nitro Mechanoid. Moving on to the new equipment, is it any good? Not at all, because most of it relies on running 9 hyperdrivers. For example, the new chest piece, Puffer Jacket, turns your yellow hyperdrivers into red hyperdrivers, but it doesn't change the fact that you don't want to be running hyperdrivers in the first place. There's a possible version of the MAXX list that does run 9 hyperdrivers. I just don't feel it will end up being as good as simply running Nitro Mechanoid, which allows you to also run block cards and doesn't rely on you having main deck hyperdrivers. And then the final new card in the Armory Deck was Clampress, which in my opinion is pretty good. Giving Banksy +2 is especially relevant because it allows you to attack with it to a higher degree, and in and of itself, Clampress plus a blue represents a 2-card 5 with the possibility of an additional steam counter on Bankbreaker or one of your hyperdrivers to keep them alive. This Clampress overall is pretty good design. It doesn't solve any of the deck's current issues, especially following the high octane banning, but it does take the deck in an interesting place, and I look forward to seeing what more support MAXX gets with high seas. Also, the story that released with the Armory Deck Boomtown Boon was really good. Please go and read it on Flesh and Blood's website. So, this brings us to the ultimate question: should you play MAXX? And there's a component of yes and no to it. MAXX, since his release, has been an underdog deck, and his biggest boon is that you get to construct Nitro Mechanoid, which is arguably one of the strongest cards in the game. MAXX also is really fun to play. He essentially plays a sub-game within the game of Flesh and Blood, where you're building up 3 hyperdrivers, keeping them alive, and then finally flipping into Nitro Mechanoid. And Nitro Mechanoid is a big robot. If you like big robots, then you will love to play Nitro Mechanoid. As discussed earlier, MAXX has always been an underdog since his release, so he can take opponents by surprise. There have been, even this weekend, a non-zero amount of games where my opponent mis-sideboarded or wasn't too sure on what my deck was trying to do, which resulted in them misplaying severely and me eventually winning the game. On the other hand, you shouldn't play MAXX Nitro if you want to work really hard to win. Since the high octane banning, the deck has essentially lost every single good matchup it has, and every single matchup it has shifted down a tier. So your good matchups have become your okay matchups have become bad matchups, and your bad matchups have become essentially unwinnable. This means that every win you get will be you clawing your way to the top and will be clawing your way back from defeat, unlike was the case when high octane was around. So if you want to work hard to win, then MAXX is not the right deck for you. In the upcoming meta as well, MAXX is going to be pretty unfavored. Aurora can be pretty difficult for MAXX to deal with, especially with the amount of damage that she's presenting, and you lose access to Arcane Barrier once you transform into Nitro Mechanoid. Jarl as well is almost unwinnable. He has way too many ways to destroy your equipment, put -1 counters on your equipment, or just give you enough frostbites to where you can't play the game. So moving into this upcoming meta, MAXX may not be the pick if you're looking for something solid or something stable to play. Additionally, MAXX has received minimal support since his release. His only 2 pieces of major support have been in Part the Mistral and through the Armory Deck. Part the Mistral bringing Supercell, which is a must include, and the Armory Deck, as we have discussed earlier, being a little bit disappointing in regards to supporting that Nitro Mechanoid playstyle. I'd like to reiterate here that MAXX is really fun to play and is my favorite hero, but he might not be the right choice for you. I just recommend testing with him and seeing whether you like that game plan or not. Moving on to the tournament recap, on Saturday, Battle Hardened Santa Clara took place, which featured 118 players and we competed over 7 rounds with 6-1 and above records making it to top 8. On the right you can see the player and hero breakdown. As for what I was expecting, I was definitely expecting more Enigma. Enigma represented about 10% of the total player count. I was certainly expecting it to be more since this is effectively your final weekend, but it seems like almost every hero is being represented here. Moving on to the actual rounds itself, my round 1 was against Azalea, Ace in the Hole. For this matchup, before you flip into Nitro Mechanoid, this is a game of making sure they're not able to get their debilitating on-hits off, especially Red and Ledger, because that effectively ends your turn. And after you flip into Nitro Mechanoid, this matchup becomes really easy because Nitro Mechanoid itself is an equipment piece and attacks for 6 overpower every single turn for free while also blocking 5. I was thankfully able to get out Nitro Mechanoid really early, and my opponent unfortunately was not able to do too much to stop me stealing the game from there. Additionally, my opponent had 3 Red and Ledgers in their hand turn 1, one of which they pitched to load the other Red and Ledger, and then used Knock the Death Whistle to find the 3rd, which they got in their arsenal. So I wasn't too worried about that at any point in the game. My round 2 was up against Arachne Slip Through the Cracks. Now normally this is a very difficult matchup because Arachne has access to a lot of debilitating on-hits, as well as shred style effects that can destroy your headpiece in heavy industry surveillance or your Nitro Mechanoid once you have constructed it. So as a MAXX player, you have to be really conservative with blocking, and you need to make sure that you are not blocking with Mechanoid at all unless you're sure they don't have shred, such as after they play a Codex of Frailty, or if you simply need to block to stay alive. Thankfully, my opponent was not too familiar into the matchup, a phrase which you will hear me say a lot, and mis-sideboarded as well as misjudged when they should be using their attack reactions and when they should be using their defense reactions, which resulted in me taking the win. Round 3, similar to the previous round, my opponent, this time being Aurora, was not too sure how to sideboard and opted for a more defensive package when they should have gone for a more offensive package. Aurora as a whole is pretty hard for MAXX to deal with because he does not have access to any defense reactions, and prior to flipping into Nitro Mechanoid, his cards don't block all that much. My opponent played an Arc Lightning on turn 1, thankfully, which I was able to mitigate most of the damage from, and they did not see any other Arc Lightnings for the rest of the game. Ultimately, I constructed Nitro Mechanoid, prayed that they did not have any major arcane damage, and then eventually took the game down by grinding away at them. Round 4, and my first loss of the day, was to Acilio, piloted by Majin Bay. In this case, because Acilio is a wizard, you cannot play Nitro Mechanoid, so I instead opted to side in Clempress and went for a more boost-focused game plan. This didn't end up going too well, partly because my opponent got a Gone in the Flash on turn 1, which they were able to repeatedly loop, and also partly because I'm not too familiar into the matchup. Normally though, I believe this should not be too hard, but unfortunately I ended up with several all-red hands and just was not able to capitalize on any sort of major damage on my opponent. The game did end up being really close, but my opponent was able to get out a huge Gone in the Flash turn, followed by a big damage spell for, I believe, 10 plus damage. Round 5 was into Florian Rotwood Harbinger, the 3rd Rosetta hero for the day. And normally, prior to the High Octane ban, this matchup was really hard because your opponent had a good place to use their chess piece, that being the turn you played High Octane. In this case though, they don't have a good spot to use it, and at any point if they ever block with Barkskin of the Millennium Tree, you simply opt not to attack with Nitro Mechanoid for that turn. Barkskin of the Millennium Tree, especially if your opponent has more than 8 Earth cards in their banish zone, is debilitating because they can essentially block on Nitro Mechanoid with 1 card in their hand. This matchup was especially close as well because I flipped a little bit too early, but I simply had to because I was worried about a Pummel, a CNC, or any other style of that effect that affects my arsenal, or Felling of the Crown, which can affect my hand. But I was able to capitalize on my opponent not being too familiar with the matchup, and them just not having access to too much arcane damage to eventually take the win. My second loss of the day was to Fang, Drakai of Blades, and this matchup, frankly speaking, was miserable. Fang as a whole is not too hard for MAXX. You simply just need to make Nitro Mechanoid as soon as possible, and then block with 2 to 3 cards, including Mechanoid, every single turn. Unfortunately, the entirety of the game, I did not see a single copy of Nitro Mechanoid that I could play. Turn 1, I banished a Nitro Mechanoid to boosting, which I then shuffled back into my deck via Supercell, and then promptly proceeded to banish another Nitro Mechanoid by boosting, which I then Supercelled back into my deck again. There was a stint of several turns where I just did not have access to major damage, and I couldn't keep boosting or sending multiple attacks at my opponent because I was worried about losing my hyperdrivers. This game ultimately really showcased what happens when MAXX cannot go online, in this case through me not being able to find Nitro Mechanoid, and my opponent was able to simply steal the game away after they got their 3rd fealty. Overall, not a good day because this locked me out of top 8, but I did definitely learn a lot about different matchups, and I do plan on updating the deck slightly following my results from these 2 tournaments. Round 7 and the final round of the day was against Prism, Awakener of Soul. This matchup is not too difficult for MAXX because you run a good density of poppers, and my opponent was not too familiar with the matchup once again. In this case though, you just want to make sure that you are not taking too much damage early. You want to save taking as much damage as possible on the turn you want to flip into Nitro Mechanoid, because Nitro Mechanoid does cost 4, and then after that you want to keep your opponent out of as much soul as possible, even if that means blocking with your entire hand, which did happen at several turns throughout this game. My overall record for the day was 5-2, which resulted in me being 14th place and just barely missing the top 8 cut. As I talked about earlier, 6-1 and above made it to top 8, so had I won one of the 2 losses instead, I would have gotten to top 8. Overall, a pretty good showing for me. I was pretty happy with how the deck was functioning, and I was looking forward to ProQuest Plus on the following day. ProQuest Santa Clara took place the following day after the Battle Hardened, and featured 53 players playing across 6 rounds. If you were 5-1 and above, you were locked in for top 8, with 2 4-2 players who ended up going 4-0, then losing their final 2 rounds, making it into top 8. Once again, on the right, you can see the hero breakdown, and definitely you can see Aurora and Enigma being the most represented decks. My first round of the day was up against New Alluring Desire. This isn't, frankly speaking, too hard of a matchup for MAXX. You simply make Mechanoid and just whittle them down. New, unfortunately, doesn't have all too many tools and resources to deal with Nitro Mechanoid, so once you are able to construct it, you can simply switch to a more aggro style game plan where you're throwing multiple attacks at them, forcing them to block, and leaving them with very few cards in hand. The only issue you can face in this matchup is if your opponent plays Bonds of Agony the turn you draw Nitro Mechanoid, in which case you need to block with it right away, losing you that card. Otherwise you risk all 3 copies being banished from your deck. Round 2 was up against Prism, Awakener of Soul, and this game ended up pretty similarly to my Prism game on the previous day, where my opponent did get off to an early lead, but once I constructed Nitro Mechanoid, I was able to keep them off of getting any soul after that point, and then I was able to stabilize the game and whittle them down with Nitro Mechanoid attacks. Round 3, and my first loss of the day was up against Jarl with Rithi. This matchup is very, very, very difficult for Max. Jarl just has so many resources to deal with your equipment, your attacks, and has a good enough defensive base to where even if you send out strong attacks, they are able to completely block it out, resulting in you getting fatigued, which is pretty much exactly what happened in this matchup. My opponent found a crumble pretty early, and a few turns later followed that up with Frozen to Death, which destroyed my chess piece, Teklo Foundry Heart, and prevented me from constructing Nitro Mechanoid that game. I also ended up banishing 3 copies of Bankbreaker via boosting and using Teklo Foundry Heart earlier in the game, and was not able to transform or construct Bankbreaker following that point, which resulted in me having no solid game plan into Jarl following that point. As I mentioned earlier, Jarl just also has quite a large access to a lot of defensive options, and was able to block out at one point when I sent out Banksy for 13 damage, which I was very sad about. Overall, I'm not too beat up about this loss because Jarl is just such a difficult matchup for Max, and one of the many reasons why I'm not looking forward to playing Max in this upcoming meta. Round 4 was up against Azalea, Ace, and the Hole, which was a win for me. Similar to what I described for the Battle Hardened, the goal in this matchup is to simply block out arrows as much as possible before you construct into Nitro Mechanoid, and then following that you are simply able to put on too much pressure for them to be able to deal any damage back to you. My opponent did get off to an early lead with quite a few dominated arrows that gave me Blood Rot Pox or affected my or arrows that affected my equipment or gave me frailties and such, but after I made Mechanoid, I was able to stabilize and take the game from there. Round 5, and my second loss of the day was to Victor Goldmane, High and Mighty. Now normally Victor is not a difficult matchup for Max. Guardians as a whole give you enough space to build your board, and you are able to construct, and if you are able to construct Nitro Mechanoid in a timely manner, you can 100% win the game. Unfortunately for me, in this matchup I was a little too worried about CNC and Pummel or any sort of other strong crush and dominate effects, so I flipped into Nitro Mechanoid very early when my opponent was at 39 life, which was definitely a mistake on my part. The game ended with my opponent being at 2 or 3 life, so I feel if I had sent out a few more attacks before constructing, or if I was able to leak a few more points of damage through, I would have definitely taken this game. Once again, not to beat up about this loss, my opponent did end up making top 8s, and they are an amazing player, but I just feel it was the little things that could have shifted the game in my favor. The final round of the day was into Enigma, Leisure of Ancestry, and this game really showed the strength of Max as a whole. My opponent got off to a very strong early lead with Raid Spectre and Waxing Spectre on their board, but prior to flipping into Nitro Mechanoid, I was able to send out enough damage into them to take some of their equipment away, as well using T-Bone, as well as sending damage to clear out some of their auras with Ward. And then once I flipped into Nitro Mechanoid, the game was pretty much over from there. I was able to block out all relevant on-hits because Nitro Mechanoid offers so much block, and I was able to send enough damage through to my opponent to where they just simply weren't able to deal with all of that damage coming in their way. One of the best parts about Max, in my opinion, is his matchup into Enigma, especially Enigma's unfamiliar with your game plan, where you can definitely steal games away. Important to note here as well, my opponent did not see a single copy of Manifestations of Mirgai until it was too late, which I will admit did definitely help me a lot. Mirgai is very difficult to deal with, and I for one am glad that Enigma will not be CC legal soon. Overall, ended the day with 4 wins and 2 losses, resulting in me getting 12th place. Once again, I'm not too beat up about the losses. An amazing showing for me, especially considering I was on Max, and I'm pretty happy with my performance for this Pro Quest. My overall record for the day was 9 wins and 4 losses, and once again, I'm super happy with this record. I was not very happy with the state of Max prior to going into the Battle Hardened and this Pro Quest, but I was definitely surprised with the results I put out. Once again, though, I feel that Max is not favored into this upcoming meta, so I may be shelving him for a bit, especially until we get High Sea spoilers, just to see what's in store for him. He will still remain my favorite hero. I will still be playing him from time to time, but he will definitely not be someone I would consider taking to any sort of competitive events, or if you're looking to top events such as this Pro Quest. Still, he is really fun to play. I definitely recommend that you check him out and at least give him a try and see how he feels to you. Making Nitro Mechanoid and being able to attack with it multiple times in the same turn is such an exciting and wonderful feeling that I feel no other hero is truly able to capture. And with all of that being said, thank you so much for watching.